Welcome to Congress 212. I'm Mike Carroll, Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at Wilfrid Laurier University. I want to welcome Congress delegates, as well as members of the local community, to the latest in our series of Big Thinking lectures. Laurier is proud to co-sponsor these lectures along with the University of Waterloo and others as a way of bringing important public intellectuals to this campus and community to speak on some of the more pressing social issues of our time. I have to tell you that I did ask one of the conference organizers why in the world this lecture was sponsored at 7:45 in the morning. And the answer I got was that if we scheduled Chris Hedges at a more convenient time, we wouldn't have a venue to hold people. So judging from the people who have turned out at this unseemly hour, I don't doubt that. So I want to thank again the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences for selecting the University of Waterloo and Laurier to co-host this. And with that, I'd like to introduce Graham Carr to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Oui, bon matin à tout le monde. Je suis Graham Carr, président de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines. Il me fait très grand plaisir de vous accueillir ce matin en si grand nombre, à si bonne heure. Let me just start by thanking not only Mike and all of his colleagues at Wilfrid Laurier University, but all of the team from the University of Waterloo as well, who have really worked to make this Congress 2012 a tremendous success. It's not over yet. We still have all of today and all of tomorrow to go. But we're really grateful for the incredible hospitality that they have shown. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, for making community participation possible at this year's Big Thinking series, and also the Canada Foundation for Innovation for their generous support in sponsoring the Big Thinking series. J'aimerais signaler, avant de commencer, que la traduction simultanée est assurée pour cette conférence. Vous pouvez retirer les écouteurs dans la halle située à l'extérieur de la salle si vous en avez besoin. The Big Thinking series gives all delegates a chance to engage in some of the most pressing conversations that affect issues, that concern issues of our time. And today, obviously, is no exception. We are thrilled to welcome Chris Hedges, who I am sure is going to challenge us and challenge those of us in the humanities and social sciences today to think about the death of the liberal class. For nearly 2 decades, Chris Hedges was a foreign correspondent for some of the United States' leading news services, including the New York Times and National Public Radio. The author of several provocative and thoughtful books, he is currently a senior fellow at the Nation Institute, has taught at Columbia University, New York, and Princeton universities. I could go on, but rather than dealing with the biography, let's just listen to Chris Hedges and give him as much time as possible. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. I have very strong Canadian ties. My wife is from Scarborough, and my daughter, who just graduated from high school, is going to UBC. So. Which is great. We're all happy. I was telling everyone I had dinner with last night, you don't usually think of Canadians as being chauvinists until they cross the border into the United States. And every July 1st, she puts up, I don't even know where she found it, a large Canadian flag in front of our house that she leaves up through July 4th. So there's no confusion in the neighborhood. I was also telling them that this is a woman, she went to Juilliard, and she's an actor, and has never come back since. But when they had this is a woman who could not tell the difference between a hockey puck and a hockey stick. And we don't own a TV, so when they had the Olympic game, when the playoff, between American, she had the radio on just to make sure the Canadians won. So I saw out there on the table that they had Days of Destruction. Days of Revolt, that's the book just literally came out. I didn't even know that bookstores could get it. That's the book I spent the last 2 years working on with the graphic illustrator Joe Sacco, who I had first met in Bosnia when he was working. I was the Balkan bureau chief for the New York Times during the war in Bosnia and Kosovo. He was working on his book Gorazda. Some of you, especially if you know the Middle East, will know Footnotes in Gaza, which is just a masterpiece. 6 years, one of the finest reporters I've ever met, and it's drawn out 50 pages of illustrations, and it's a look at the sacrifice zones, the poorest pockets of the United States, and now in an age of unfettered, unregulated capitalism, these sacrifice zones are just spreading outwards. There is no impediment anymore to unfettered capitalism. It is, as Karl Marx understood, a revolutionary force, and as Karl Polanyi pointed out in The Great Transformation, his amazing text on what unregulated, unfettered capitalism looks like, it turns everything into a commodity. Human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that it exploits until exhaustion or collapse. In essence, it cannibalizes itself, and this is the process that we are undergoing. The question I had was, how did we get here? And that's really the subject of Death of the Liberal Class. Empire of Illusion is also out there. Empire of Illusion is sort of a look at all of the ways we have been unplugged and invested our hopes, ideas, and dreams into a non-reality based world. The largest chapter in the book is on pornography, which is not accidental. We're the most pornified culture in history because of its easy accessibility. And it was interesting, I was a war correspondent for 20 years, and in every conflict I was in, there was a correlating rise with porn, the porn industry, because it does the same thing. It is about turning human beings into objects that you exploit and use. And it's no accident, and I won't spend too long on the thesis of that book, but it's no accident the still photographs from Abu Ghraib could be still photographs from a porn shoot. It's precisely the same thing at work within the society, the loss of empathy. I spent a lot of time on reality TV. I had been asked by a publisher, Knopf, and it's a good lesson, if I'm sure there are many writers in the room, never do someone else's idea, to write a book on the press, of which I, of course, had been a part of for many years in the United States, and its demise. And when I turned the manuscript into Knopf, the editor read it and hated it. And Knopf volunteered that they would publish it after they assigned someone to excise what they termed all the negativity in the book. You can imagine how that went down. And so I raced off to Nation Books. You get half of your advance up front, and so I just got them to write a check, and I told them you can have the whole book, to write a check for what Knopf had paid me, so they couldn't destroy my book. I certainly understand the inner workings of the press far better than editors at Knopf. What they wanted was that mythical version of the democratic press without fear and favor, Watergate, Pentagon Papers, all this kind of stuff, without understanding the huge drawbacks of the commercial press. I do agree that the demise, especially of newsprint, is something that is deeply harmful, perhaps even catastrophic, to our democracy. And yet at the same time, I understand the deep deficiencies of the press. As Sidney Schanberg says, it's not so much that the press makes things better, but it stops things from getting worse. And as these newspapers die, we are watching courts, police, city halls, all of it doesn't get covered, not to mention, of course, what's happened to the art form of investigative journalism, which is, and certainly in the United States, has been all but decimated for many reasons, not only because of budget cuts, but because the security and surveillance state has made it almost impossible now to get information. Barack Obama has used the Espionage Act 6 times since he took office to go after leakers and whistleblowers, some of whom, including Sterling, the CIA agent who allegedly leaked to the New York Times, including information about war crimes. The Espionage Act was never meant to be a weapon against the practice of journalism. It was passed by Woodrow Wilson in 1917, was only used 3 times against leakers, once, first time against Daniel Ellsberg for the Pentagon Papers. So when I began the process of transferring this book to Nation Books, I thought that it wasn't just the pillars or just the press itself that had collapsed, but all of the pillars of the liberal establishment. Labor, culture, which had become commercialized completely, certainly in the United States. It is, I know it's better in Canada, a little better. And religious institutions, public education, and of course the Democratic Party. And it's interesting that one of the figures that I go after in the book is someone I've known many, many years, and that's Michael Ignatieff. Michael and I, at the inception of the Iraq War, came down on very different sides. The day the invasion started, we were both on a program called Fresh Air on National Public Radio, and Michael spent 15 minutes explaining why we had to go into the war, and I spent 15 minutes, and I should add, I am an Arabic speaker who spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, months of my life in Iraq, and unlike Michael, actually intimately understand the instrument of war as to why we shouldn't go in. And Michael, for me, was sort of a kind of poster child of what had happened in many ways to the liberal establishment, that conversion into kind of neoliberalism. And I actually went back and found the transcripts of that radio interview and included them in the book, because he's without question a brilliant scholar, and we've had a close relationship over many, many years. I've not seen him since he came to Canada and became a politician, is now at Massey College. And so I backed off, and I wanted to ask that fundamental question: what happened? How did we get here? How did the leviathan of unfettered, unregulated capitalism become omnipotent, so omnipotent that it couldn't be challenged by any of the forces within society? Those forces which I think in sort of traditional political terms are defined as liberal, in the way Karl Popper uses the term, those forces that make incremental or piecemeal reform possible. I know when Conrad Black wrote his biography of Roosevelt, he said that Roosevelt, I think correctly, that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that Roosevelt saved capitalism. What went wrong? How did we end up? And certainly within the United States, it all goes back to World War I, where on the eve of World War I, you had powerful progressive movements, over 70 socialist mayors in the United States. Some of the largest publications in the country, Appeal to Reason, which had the 4th highest circulation in the United States, was a socialist publication. Of course, the masses. You had anarcho-syndicalist unions like the Wobblies, a very progressive CIO. I mean, one of the reasons that Canadians have, as I understand it, a healthcare system that covers everyone is because the unions fought for it. They had a broad social vision. And the business or the robber baron class was, of course, deeply hostile to all of these movements. And the war was, to quote a writer I admire very much, Dwight MacDonald, was the rock on which all of these movements were broken. The war had no popular support in the United States. Indeed, Wilson had run for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But with the collapse of the Eastern Front and the possibility that the Germans could move upwards of 100 divisions over to the Western Front, it became possible that the British and the French would be defeated, and this deeply alarmed Wall Street, which had lent tremendous sums of money to the British and the French government. This, coupled with the Kaiser's decision to attempt to impose a naval blockade on Britain and the sinking of 2 or 3 American merchant ships, plunged us into the war. And it's a fascinating period of intellectual history. And it really, at this moment, revolves around a figure named Walter Lippmann, who writes Public Opinion, which is the blueprint for control. It's where the term manufacturing consent comes from. Chomsky and Herman, years later, in their critique of the press, pull that from Lippmann's book, Public Opinion. And Lippmann argues to Wilson that the population can be moved to support the war, not through the harsher forces of coercion embodied in the Sedition Act or the Espionage Act, but through mass propaganda. And that gives rise to the Committee for Public Information, or the Creel Commission, because it was headed by a former muckraking journalist named George Creel, who ends his career working for McCarthy and Nixon in the House Un-American Affairs activity hearings, where they employ the understanding of crowd psychology pioneered by Le Bon, Trotter, and of course Sigmund Freud. Out of the Creel Commission comes Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations, and his book Propaganda becomes one of the seminal texts that Goebbels uses when he creates the Nazi propaganda machine. And it was that understanding that people are moved by emotion, not by fact. And they create all sorts of mechanisms, powerful mechanisms within that propaganda machine to do precisely that. So they have their own film division where they're making movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. They have their own news division. Every single paper must have a pro-war stance or it cannot publish. That's what sees the masses, which refuses to accept it, shut down. Appeal to Reason continues to publish its editorials of pro-war. It has speakers bureaus going around the country, graphic. And it's when you look at those intellectuals who resisted, particularly Randolph Bourne and Jane Addams, one of the undercurrents of everything they write about is the despair about the intellectual class itself, because it is so easily seduced by this force of propaganda. That's a constant refrain in both Bourne and Addams. And of course, this mechanism is used not only to promote the war, but to break the back of these radical and progressive movements. And it does so quite effectively. Those who hold out, like Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate, who in 1912 polled 6% of the vote, 900,000 votes, ends up in prison. And what happens is that once that war is over, the dreaded Hun instantly becomes the dreaded Red. And MacDonald, when he writes about this period, also notes that none of the political theorists of the 19th century had anticipated the psychosis of permanent war. When Marx writes about war, it's about the Prussian War, and he certainly hopes that the Germans will win because it will bring us closer to the worker state. And in essence, that psychosis of permanent war, in MacDonald's words, creates an environment by which people clamor for their own enslavement. And I think that that's deeply true, and that is perhaps a distinction between Canadian and American society. But at that point, we became a nation of permanent war, an attempt to ferret out internal enemies and fight external enemies. And of course, the iconography and language of that was replaced at the end of the Cold War with terrorism, but it serves precisely the same purpose. And that leads to Randolph Bourne's famous dictum, "War is the health of the state." So after the war, you have that final assault against very weakened popular movements. Both appeal to reason, and the masses are shut down. That's when you have the mass deportations of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, the destruction of the Wobblies, Joe Hill, what they would take the leaders of the Wobblies, pin trumped up murder charges, bogus murder charges on them. Hill is executed in Utah. Big Bill Haywood has to flee the country, spends the last 10 years of his life in Moscow. And accompanying this is that all of those propagandists, once the war is over, go straight to Madison Avenue. And they start working for Wall Street and corporations. And what they seek to do is upend traditional values of thrift, self-effacement, and replace it with a cult of the self, with hedonism, with consumption as an inner compulsion. And Laura Nader, who teaches at Berkeley, and is Ralph Nader's sister, I think correctly points out that that what happens is that when that these values were replaced by corporate values. That when we talk about American culture, what at this point we're really talking about is an imposed corporate culture. When Malcolm Cowley writes his really brilliant intellectual memoir of the 20s and 30s, An Exile's Return, he's very critical of the Bohemians and later the Beats for imbibing or essentially internalizing these cultural values, that center, that self, that destruction of community. At this point, we begin that long, slow descent by which the mechanisms which make democratic reform possible are essentially being destroyed. Because while the radical forces or the populist forces are dismantled, you have, in the name of anti-communism, a disemboweling of traditional liberal institutions. That's what these witch hunts are about. And the function of liberal institutions, of these pillars of the liberal establishment, is precisely to work as a kind of safety valve, whereby when you have pronounced grievances and injustices within the wider society, it is a mechanism within the formal structures of power to alleviate those injustices through incremental or piecemeal reform. But all of the true advances within democracy are pushed forward not by these liberal institutions which survive within the parameters of a capitalist democracy, but by those popular radical movements that create pressure which the liberal establishment then responds to. I mean, within the United States, if you go back, and this is what Zinn does so well in The People's History of the United States, you see that the structure of American government was put in place by people who deeply feared popular democracy. Not only were most Americans disenfranchised at the constitutional conventions, women, people without property, Native Americans, African Americans, indentured servants, but you had put in place both the Electoral College and the Senate. Senators used to be appointed by the states, and the Senate had most of the political power in terms of the legislative branch to prevent popular democracy. So it was a constant battle from the formation of the country, a battle that many, many people paid for with their lives, whether that was through the anti-slavery movement, the Liberty Party, the labor movement, the suffragists who fought for women's rights. All of these created openings within the society, and yet none of them ever achieved formal positions of political power. And I hear, come down with Chomsky on this, in that or Benda, in his great book Treason of the Intellectuals, that there, for those of us who care about creating a system of justice and a system where broad participation of the population is open to everyone, you have a choice between which two sets of principles you serve: justice and truth, or privilege and power. And Benda makes the argument that, he's talking about the intellectual and the academic class, but the more, having gone to graduate school at Harvard and seen the Kennedy School, there's a perfect poster child for this, the more that you make concessions to those whose fealty is to privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And I think that, that we forgot this dictum, we forgot this fundamental truth. We saw, of course, in the 30s the collapse of capitalism, and then we saw the liberal class function as it was designed to function, which was to create the New Deal, to create mechanisms by which the injustices that had been visited on wide swaths of the American population could be alleviated. This was essentially crushed after World War II with that last and final assault in the Red Scare. We lost in the United States thousands of high school teachers, social workers. It used to be that social workers, the social work union would lobby on behalf of their clients, university professors, artists, directors, journalists like I.F. Stone, probably our greatest investigative journalist, who becomes a complete pariah. He can't even get a job at The Nation magazine, and he starts I.F. Stone weekly in the basement of his house. And at that point, all of the impediments to unregulated, unfettered capitalism were off. It was just a matter of dismantling what had been put in place by the New Deal, so that by the 1970s, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, America had shifted from what he called an empire of production to an empire of consumption, i.e. we began to borrow to maintain both an empire and a level of consumption that we could no longer afford. There's a book by Sheldon Wolin. Sheldon Wolin is our greatest living political philosopher. His great 1960 work, Politics and Vision, is certainly one of the classics of 20th century political philosophy in the United States. He wrote a book a few years ago called Democracy Incorporated. And in it, he argues that we no longer live in a democracy. He lives in a system that he terms inverted totalitarianism. And by that, he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in classical totalitarian regimes, you have a demagogue or a charismatic leader who, with a reactionary or revolutionary party, overthrows a decaying structure and replaces it. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to be loyal to the Constitution, electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have subverted all the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. John Ralston Saul gets a lot of this and got it really early. He calls it a coup d'etat in slow motion. And that's correct. That's precisely what's happened. So we end up with this kind of ridiculous species which we're now enduring in the United States. Obama's trying to raise $1 billion for this campaign, of political theater, what Benjamin Demotte called junk politics, where the personal narrative of the candidate becomes paramount in terms of your electoral choice. But in fact, there's utter continuity. And when you look at all of the programs in the Obama administration, it is a seamless continuity with the Bush administration. In fact, the tragedy of the Obama administration is that they have codified the destruction of domestic and international law put in place by the Bush administration. And I don't know how closely you follow what's been happening in the United States. Obama has not only not restored habeas corpus, it's always interesting to see the echoes in Canada. And we do everything wrong, and then you copy us. It's sort of really quite remarkable. But you take law, what is it, Law 78? Yeah. And yeah, there you go. I mean, this is what Rahm Emanuel just did in Chicago. You have the FISA Amendment Act, which I'm one of the plaintiffs. We just got to the Supreme Court to challenge it. The FISA Amendment Act, which Obama voted for, is a really pernicious piece of legislation. It retroactively makes legal or made legal what under our Constitution was traditionally illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of hundreds of millions of American citizens. And now they're building a gigantic supercomputer in Utah to store all this information forever. And the reason that the FISA Amendment Act was passed is because Bush had begun this warrantless wiretapping. He'd been challenged in court. It was clearly unconstitutional. The telecommunications companies, Verizon and AT&T, which had turned this information over to the government, did not want to have to pay off these lawsuits. And so they came in with their sort of buckets of money in our system of legalized bribery. And lo and behold, they were retroactively immune, and it was allowed to go forward. Obama, as I mentioned, has used the Espionage Act 6 times since he was president. Investigative journalism, and I have many friends in the business, has virtually died in the United States because of this. It is just terrifying. And Obama, on December 31st, passed or signed the National Defense Authorization Act. Section 1021 of that act permits the U.S. government, permitted the U.S. government to use the military to detain American citizens in very vague language, who covered persons were people who substantially supported al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or what they called associated forces, hold them in military facilities, including our offshore penal colonies, indefinitely until, in the language of the bill, the end of hostilities. It is truly a terrifying assault. I sued the president, Anley and Panetta, in court, and we won. It was we just remarkably found a judge, Catherine Forrest, in federal court, who stood up and issued a temporary injunction. Now, what the government will do, we don't know. They have 60 days to file an appeal, in which case it would go to an appellate court, be reviewed, and then if that decision was upheld, it would go to the Supreme Court. And frankly, given the composition of the Supreme Court, it may be a Pyrrhic victory, but it's one that has to be fought on every single level. So with that system of inverted totalitarianism, which Wolin writes about, we have descended into a political process where it has become utterly impossible to defy the centers of power, which are, as Occupy Wall Street understood, are based not in Washington but based on Wall Street. And it's, the tragedy of the United States, and I think, something again that's been echoed in Canada, is that we didn't understand that manufacturing is part of vital national security. We no longer protected it. We turned over the economy and finally the political process to a class of speculators. Speculators in the 17th century were hung. Speculation was a crime, capital crime, and today they have created a system whereby they control both our political and economic life. Polanyi's book, and I'm sure many of you know it, is a really brilliant book. He was, of course, Hungarian. His wife, it was during the Red Scare, he taught at Columbia, and the Americans would not allow his wife into the country. And so they actually lived in Toronto, and Polanyi would fly down for classes Monday through Friday and fly back to Toronto to see his wife on the weekends. But Polanyi actually uses the word sacred. He said that when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when nothing has an intrinsic value beyond a monetary value, then it in essence commits collective suicide. And that's why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. The commodification of nature, like the commodification of human beings. And there is no way within the political system to stop it. Certainly within the United States, I'm not going to try and give you an analysis of the Canadian political system, despite my deep distaste for your Prime Minister. But there's certainly no way to stop it in the United States. Barack Obama isn't going to stop it. The Democratic Party isn't going to stop it. And that's why I invested so much time and energy into Occupy, the Occupy movement. And I think that what's happening in Quebec is what I would like to see happen in the United States. I covered all of the revolutions most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I was in Leipzig for all of those demonstrations. And I think Václav Havel's right in his great essay, The Power of the Powerless. When you face a system that decayed, there is a tremendous power which comes with living in truth and exposing the truth. And I think that's precisely what Occupy did. It named the problem. And it the whole debate up until the arrival of Occupy in the United States was over deficits. We have to impose austerity for our deficits, something that's being rammed down the throats of the Europeans. Of course, it wasn't a problem of deficits. It was a problem of revenue. It was a problem of economic income disparity. And I think the state was terrified. You went into Zuccotti Park on a weekend, and you had mothers and fathers from New Jersey pushing strollers up and down the park. This was a mainstream movement. And if you look at all of the polling, that backs that up, whether it's on the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, whether it's on the bailouts in Wall Street, whether it's on the failure to address the massive foreclosure and bank repossession crisis, which has driven 6 million Americans from their homes, a number expected to climb to 10 this year. I forget the figures, I just read it, but it's like 50 or 60% of Americans are underwater, meaning that they owe more than their homes are worth. 1 million personal bankruptcies a year because people can't pay their medical bills, and 80% of those people had medical insurance. But of course, they just jack the premiums up if you're incapacitated and you can't pay and you're out. Student debt, this was a huge factor in Zuccotti, $1 trillion, largest personal debt. There is the Congress, of course, at the urging of these corporations, passed a bill whereby there is no way to escape student debt. Even if you declare bankruptcy in the United States, it just accrues interest. The only way to escape your debt is when you die, literally. It's quite staggering. And I think that one of the sort of perfect examples of how the differences between the Democratic and the Republican Party are marginal at best, because of course in the end corporate lobbyists write all of the legislation, is the so-called Obamacare bill. That health care program was designed by the Heritage Foundation, of a right-wing corporate-funded think tank. And it was put in place by Romney when he was governor in 2006 in Massachusetts, and then it was adopted by Obama after the corporate lobbyists wrote in $447 billion worth of subsidies, the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry. And the first thing the Obama administration did once the bill was passed, and as you know, it's being challenged in the Supreme Court, is to grant exemptions, because these corporations don't want to insure chronically ill children, which in moral terms, as a former seminarian, means that I live in a country where it is legally permissible for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents frantically bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. That's the world that we've created. We have very little time left. We are watching Europe implode, both, of course, in Greece and Spain. And I just was on a program, Democracy Now!, a week or two ago with Paul Krugman. It was me and then Paul. We weren't on together. But afterwards, I was talking to Krugman about, and he said, you know what, it all doesn't matter anyway, given climate change. And he's right. None of these corporate forces, and I know this is a battle you're fighting in Canada with the tar sands, and of course Canada's just absolutely disastrous decision to withdraw from Kyoto, or refuse to abide by the Kyoto Accords, that none of the formal mechanisms of power are going to impede this destruction of the ecosystem on which human life depends. It's only going to come through acts of civil disobedience. And certainly the most important moral voices in the United States that I respect, Wendell Berry, Cornel West, Bill McKibben, they've all come to the same conclusion, and all of us have therefore been arrested. Wendell, 77, he and other activists occupied the governor's office in Kentucky, and when he went in, he said, well, you know, going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government, but I'm afraid that's what we have to do. As I don't know how closely you follow my own sort of battles in the States, but I've been very critical of the Black Bloc anarchist movement, and they now follow me around. They're unfortunately not here today, but they follow me around from speech to speech because I think that this movement has to remain nonviolent in order to succeed. And just to close, we'll go back to my own experience in Eastern Europe. Now, I covered the fall of East Germany. This was, at least until the rise of the security and surveillance state in the United States, the most intrusive regime probably on the planet, the Stasi. I think for every 63 East Germans there was an informant, and that regime was brought to its knees. And it was brought to its knees by primarily Lutheran clerics in Leipzig. It had this, and Havel had this intuitive understanding that it's not that you assault the structures of power, it's that you draw them towards you. That you create, through acts of nonviolence, paralysis within those structures of power. So that when the Leipzig demonstrators start pulling, in September of 1989, 70,000 people into the street, Erich Honecker, who had been in power for 18 years, sends an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. And when they get there, the officers go into the barracks, and the paratroopers, many of them are weeping because they have brothers, sisters, fathers, friends walking in those streets. And they can't bring themselves. The local Communist Party officials in Leipzig block the order. And Honecker lasts another week in office. In Czechoslovakia, in Prague, in that winter, and this is really the power of resistance, that, as Daniel Berrigan says, that capacity or that belief that the good draws the good. There were pictures of a former Charles University student, Jan Panic, all over the streets of Prague. Panic, in 1968, after the Soviet invasion, had lit himself on fire in Wenceslas Square and died 4 days later of his burns. When they carried his body to the cemetery, thousands of students from Charles University, the communist regime broke it up. When they buried him and his grave became a shrine, they dug his remains up, cremated his remains, gave them to his mother, and told his mother that she wasn't allowed to rebury them. And yet his picture was everywhere. 2 weeks after the communist regime fell, there were 10,000 people crowded into Red Army Square, and Havel renamed Red Army Square in the center of Prague, Jan Panic Square. I was in Wenceslas Square, 500,000 people, when Marta Kubasheva, who was the great, most popular singer in Yugoslavia, sang the anthem of defiance that was broadcast over the airwaves when the Soviet tanks rolled into Prague, walked out on that balcony. Now, after the Dubček was overthrown and the Stalinist or the Moscow-approved regime was put back in place, you saw Kubasheva become a non-person. All of her recording stock was destroyed. Her voice was no longer heard on the airwaves. And when she walked out, this was 1968 to 1989, no Czech had heard her sing. And she walked out on that balcony and began to sing that anthem of defiance, and every Czech around me knew every word. That is the power of defiance, the power of another narrative, what Havel calls living in truth. And I don't know where Occupy is going to go. No one knows. Movements have, as Lenin and Herzen and others pointed out, a kind of mysterious life force of their own. Even those who purportedly lead these movements don't know where they're going. I saw that in the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. I saw it in the 2 Palestinian uprisings that I covered, the first and the second Intifada. I remember sitting with the leaders in Leipzig on November 9th, 1989, in which they said, perhaps within a year, there will be free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. And I think as Saul, who I admire immensely, has pointed out, we are in one of those periods in history where the language and vocabulary we use to describe the reality around us no longer matches that reality itself. And we are in a process of inventing or creating a new language, a new way to explain and cope with reality. And I encourage all of you to do what I'll be doing in a few days in New York, and that's get out on the street. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris, for a terrific talk. To steal one of your lines, there isn't much time left, but we have about 20 minutes for questions, just so people are clear. We're going to finish at 8:55, after which there will be a book signing in the back. You'll have an opportunity to talk to Chris one-on-one then. I know we'll have far more questions than time. Si vous voulez poser des questions, il y a des micros situés à chaque côté de la salle. Please identify yourself. Try to keep your questions short, and maybe I'll just kick off things. I want to go back to the reference to Walter Lippmann, manufacturing consent, and the role of propaganda, the rise of a corporate culture of hedonism, etc., and the decline of investigative journalism and the crowding out of other narrative opportunities to challenge consensus. In the current context, I think there are probably some media proponents who would argue that the antidote to that is the rise of social media. And I wondered if you could just comment on the role of social media in the current manifestations that we are seeing around the world.
Well, there's very little reporting done on the internet, almost none. There's some very fine commentary. I think social media has become a very effective tool in terms of logistics. You have to be here at this time, but I don't think it's a very effective tool in terms of actually creating opposition. When you're sitting in your room in front of a computer, furiously typing something out on Facebook, you're still alone, which is just where the corporate state wants you. There is no substitute for what's happening in Quebec and for what I hope will happen in the United States, and that is pulling large numbers of people into the streets to discredit those in power. The other problem I have with the internet is that it inverts the whole process of reporting. As a reporter, you go out, you get your story, you cross-check it with other sources, it's edited, it's fact-checked, and that doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, and then it's printed. In the internet, you just throw anything out there. And it's emotionally driven. People tend to gravitate to their intellectual ghettos, and I think I'm as guilty of this as everyone else. I don't go to the NRA website, or I don't go to Bill O'Reilly's website, or does Kevin O'Leary have a website? I don't go to that either. And there's something kind of, there's a democratic quality to news print in a sense that you don't select what you get. And what really scares me, and I think this is something Hannah Arendt writes about in Origins of Totalitarianism, is that it furthers this process of severing yourself from a reality-based culture. It accelerates a world where lies become true, where facts and opinions are interchangeable, where you believe what you want to believe. And that, of course, is what Fox and, is it Sun, is your Fox equivalent? That's what they're about. It's not about fact. And once you cut yourself, the power of traditional journalism, or the importance of traditional journalism, and I could spend a whole another morning talking about its shortcomings, but the importance of it is that it roots your national discourse in verifiable fact. I did a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. And I was in a creationist seminar where they were teaching in Missouri, and they were teaching Christian teachers how to teach the book of Genesis. Well, there are a couple problems as a former seminarian with Genesis as factual history, perhaps the first one being that the writers of Genesis thought the earth was flat. The second one being that God created a light on the first day and the sun on the fourth day. And this was a problem that the teachers were being told to overcome by telling these boys and girls that God created a temporary light. Now, there's nothing in Genesis to suggest that God created temporary light, but it's in the details that you see the disconnect from the real. And in the midst of this talk, this teacher goes off on a tirade against the New York Times. And I'm sure I was the only New York Times reader in the room. But it was a window for me into, as a liberal paper. It's not about liberalism. The New York Times is not a liberal newspaper. It's about that issue of retaining a discourse in verifiable fact, which they must destroy. And that, as Arendt points out, really is the bedrock for totalitarian systems, once you sever discourse from verifiable fact.
Great, thank you. Okay, starting with the lineup on the right here.
Thank you for a truly inspiring kick to my day, probably my life. Can you please speak to what's been going on in Iceland?
Uh-oh.
Oh. Just to prime the pump a bit, I'm to understand that the people in Iceland actually did what you're encouraging us to do. Sorry, I didn't mean to put...
I don't know the situation in Iceland very well. Other than that, and other than the fact that they have managed to re-kickstart their economy because of it. But I don't have any particular real insight into Iceland.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay, you're lonely at that microphone, so here you go.
I'll still keep it short, though. My question is largely focusing on an issue I'm constantly struggling with concerning scale. When you're talking about organizing this defiance and seeing how it needs to express itself as people, but I feel we always sort of frame it in this context of nationalism, and we just sort of default to that. And some people want to stretch beyond and talk in this global, but often people in the street, that's such a local, that's such a place-based sort of phenomenon. So can you speak with this defiance, how do we make it as effective, efficient, and connected as possible? Do we default to national, bigger, smaller?
Well, in the first week in Zuccotti, it was interesting, the composition including people who on their own had come over from Spain and other places to essentially give the organizers of Zuccotti their own experience and spell out their own failings and what had gone wrong. And I know that there's a lot of communication between the Occupy movement and other movements globally. So I think that this movement is, in many ways, a global movement. Nationalism, I know as a war correspondent, is a disease. And I watched it after 9/11. I mean, for me, the greatest tragedy of 9/11 is that, we had garnered the empathy of the world, including the Muslim world, where I was covering Al-Qaeda at the time. You don't fight terrorism, and terrorists have been with us since Sallust wrote about it in the Jakartan Wars. But through conventional military force. You fight terrorist groups or radical groups by isolating them within their own society. And we had essentially achieved that. And yet we drank deep from that very dark elixir of nationalism. And nationalism is not only always about self-exaltation, but it is racism. It's about the denigration of the other. If we had had the courage to be vulnerable, we would be far more secure and safer today than we are. And so nationalism is, I think, as you correctly point out, is a deeply pernicious and dangerous ideology or force, because it essentially renders you deaf, dumb, and blind and destroys the capacity for empathy. So the more nationalism creeps into these movements, the more distorted and finally deformed they'll become.
Thank you.
Over here?
Yeah, from my perspective, this is the microphone on the left, but we won't argue about that. I just want to say, Mr. Hedges, as far as I'm concerned, I want to thank you. I think you are the Prophet Amos of our 21st century. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, how about a question from this side then?
Hello. First of all, a great talk. I really enjoyed it. A concern that often comes up for me is, like you quickly mentioned it, the issues of the climate crisis in terms of this. But I still feel like often in the discourse we always kind of like mention it and then kind of veer back into our own like human dramas. And then it's also tied to, I have a question about, so you said you criticized the Black Bloc because of not, like it should be nonviolent, which I agree with, definitely in terms of human life, and like I'm not so prone myself to throw a brick into a window kind of thing, but that's different. But more, I think, is my question is in terms of the environmental crisis. So there's people out there that are arguing, like, yeah, it would be better if we could do everything in terms of like dealing with ourselves, but it's so unstoppable, like all the dams and nuclear power. Like, I'm wondering what you think of violence towards property in terms of stopping environmental crisis.
Well, I've had a few debates with Derek Jensen about precisely this issue. My only fear is that once you start using plastic explosives, people get hurt. I would say that the issue of climate change is separate from the issue of the Black Bloc, because for me, the Black Bloc is the mechanism by which the security and surveillance state will seek to sever these movements from the mainstream by frightening them away. And that is the goal, because these are mainstream movements. The issue of, I think that a realistic understanding of power would have to say that there is no way to stop the fossil fuel industry from killing us, given the current political configurations, which is why I've invested so much time in the Occupy movement in an attempt to build mass movements that seek to thwart their power. But with the pipeline, Obama is now, drilling in ways even Sarah Palin didn't imagine. It's really, truly terrifying and utterly suicidal. And I just, having spent so much of my life around violence, I understand the poison that it is. That even when you employ violence in what is purportedly a just cause, it contaminates you. And that was true in the war in El Salvador, it was true in Sarajevo, it's true everywhere I've been. So for me, violence is always tragic. And yet, I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo when it was being hit with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. When I got there in '95, 45 foreign reporters had been killed. And we all knew that if the Serbs broke through that trench system that had been built around the city, a third of the city would be slaughtered and the rest would be driven into displacement and refugee camps. And that wasn't hypothetical, because that's what had happened in Vukovar, the Drina Valley and other places that the Serbs had taken over. And yet that didn't free the defenders of Sarajevo from the contamination of violence. So that the first defenders of the city were all gangsters, cello, and they all came out of the criminal class. So I've seen how, when I went to El Salvador in the early 80s, the death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. So one understands with that level of violence why people would react violently. And I don't, it's not certainly beyond the realm of imagination that as things deteriorate, the security and surveillance state would react on that level. But I'm desperately hoping that we can do everything in the interim to prevent that, and can do it nonviolently.
Thank you.
Okay, look, I don't know if it's left or right. Maybe it's west and east, but you're next.
Hi, good morning. First of all, I'd like to say I deeply admire what yourself and people like Professor Chomsky are doing, going around giving public talks, which segues into my question, I think. Are we getting off the hook a little bit in this room? I think that is there a responsibility, as Chomsky wrote in the late 60s there, of the intellectual to engage with the public?
Yes, and I think that I'm not going to go after Canadian intellectuals because there's more of them in this room than but let me talk about American intellectuals. They don't engage, and the cowardice. When we did I love Cornell, and when we did the People's Hearing of Goldman Sachs, Cornell and I went in the night before, and we did all the organizing with the Occupy committee, and then Cornell and I went out to dinner, and Cornell leaned across the table and he goes, "Where are all these so-called intellectuals?" And that's a good question. Where are they? And Cornell goes, they're all too busy. And it's American universities, and I've taught it, some of them have become completely corporatized. People retreat into their very arcane disciplines. I have a kind of deep dislike of Marxian literary theory, which is unreadable and meant to be unreadable. I think it's just, there are all sorts of mechanisms by which people can make themselves feel morally and intellectually superior without actually having any effect at all on the wider society. And that has certainly become a safe way to retain your position at a university. I mean, we use the system of tenure, but what we forget is that people are completely conditioned by the time they get tenure, and I went to graduate school and saw the process. And so it is sort of deeply disturbing how complicit the academy is in the solidification of the corporate state. It's careerism. There's a really great memoir of the Holocaust called Prisoner of Fear, published in 1948 by an Austrian doctor who had smuggled Jews out of Austria and then been caught and sent to Auschwitz, and she becomes a doctor in the women's section of the camp. And she writes profiles of Mengele and all the Nazi leadership, and she said most of them didn't believe any of it. It was all careerism. I mean, careerism becomes really, a disempowering disease.
Eichmann as well, I guess.
Yeah. So I've been deeply, deeply disappointed with the academy. And you have a few figures like Chomsky or Cornell, but boy, you can pretty much run them up on one hand.
Yeah. Thank you.
Over to this side.
As a Jewish academic, I'd like to first of all mention my Palestinian colleague, Dr. Yusuf Abdul Haq, who's currently under administrative detention since December, which was prolonged twice now already. My question is, would you care to elaborate on the theory of direct democracy as an alternative to a liberal representative democracy?
Yeah. I watched the whole evolution in Zuccotti, and I really came away with a great admiration for Kropotkin. Because Kropotkin, and he had started out, of course, as an animal behaviorist. Kropotkin made two, I think, really important observations. His first contribution being that it's not survival of the fittest. It is survival of those who cooperate. And he talks about herds, when you get a wounded animal and the herd protects it. But then he also talks about tribal society. And he said, consensus never seems to work once you get above a group of 150. And in order for consensus to continue, those groups that swell above 150, 3, 4, tend to break off and form smaller groups that still can continue to operate in a consensus fashion. And that's precisely what happened at Zuccotti. Consensus worked when the numbers were low. By the time you were pulling 4,000 or 5,000 people into a general assembly, consensus was paralysis. And I think that Kropotkin's right, that consensus doesn't work with numbers that large, especially when, and I'm sure you're familiar with the system of governance that went on in Zuccotti, you give any group or any individual within that assembly the possibility of a block. And they lost control of the park at the end because of that. So I'm all for direct democracy, but at least from what I saw in New York, it doesn't work on a really large scale.
But what about the federal principle of Prud'homme's, the Federation of Federations, as an extension, extrapolation of that?
You know more about it than I do. I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'll go back and read Proudhon.
Okay, we have time, unfortunately, for just one more question in the room. As I mentioned, Chris will be signing books outside, so those of you who are waiting at the microphones perhaps can take it up one-to-one with him afterwards. So, please.
Hello. My question also deals with the role of intellectuals in sort of dealing with global issues and activism, and more specifically the social sciences. Do you have any advice for particularly those who are in charge of the social science system, senior administrators and senior faculty, for how they can nurture the kind of intellectual activity that might help contribute to the overall discussion?
You can't teach people to be moral. You have to be moral. My great mentor at Harvard was a man named James Luther Adams, who in 1935 and 1936 went to Germany to study. The Nazis, of course, were in power. He dropped out of the University of Heidelberg and worked with Niemöller and Bonhoeffer and Albert Schweitzer and Karl Barth in the underground confessing church until he was picked up by the Gestapo and interrogated and deported. And I remember Adams telling me, if the Nazis took over America tomorrow, 60% of the Harvard faculty would happily begin their lectures with the Nazi salute. And I think, going back to that memoir, Prisoner of Fear, that I mentioned, which unfortunately had one printing in 1948, you'll have to get it out of the rare book room. It is careerism. It is that, what Malraux calls that process of building a monument to yourself. And we just, to pick a small example, I speak at Union Theological Seminary, and there's been some problems with the president of Union, and the students have been great and have organized and held meetings, and the faculty is out the door. Now here's an institution that purports to teach ethics and morality, and yet even within the institution they won't stand up for an issue of justice. And I think that it disempowers and discredits. I think that the figures who actually hold fast. I had another great professor, Krister Stendahl, who was the dean of the Divinity School and who had called for the ordination of women. in the Lutheran Church before women were ordained. And he was one of the finalists to be the Bishop of Stockholm, and when he got to the airport for his interview, the Swedish press ambushed him and said, well, Bishop Stendahl, how do you feel about a church that doesn't ordain women? How do you feel about, and he said, a church that doesn't ordain women doesn't deserve to call itself Christian. Well, he was out the door. He ended up becoming, years later, the Bishop of Stockholm. But I think for those of us who was his students, that was probably more important in many ways than Augustine or anything else that he taught us. And careerism, like nationalism, is a disease. I think that living the moral life means that inevitably you will clash with whatever institution you work for. And as Paul Tillich correctly pointed out, all institutions, including the church, are inherently demonic. And that means that we have to be willing to, number one, never allow any institution to define us. And number two, deep six our own career. And the academy is not any better or worse, but that kind of subservience to career, makes possible what Kant calls radical evil.
I'm really glad you asked this question, because here we are in the middle of a Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, and part of our challenge is to demonstrate what the worth to society is of the work that we do, the research and teaching that we do. If you look at the screen, you'll see that there are three themes that we have traditionally associated with the Voir Grand lecture series: transform, inspire, challenge. Starting really with the Governor General's talk, Big Thinking talk on Saturday, and continuing through Margaret Atwood's talk, and today Chris's talk. I think we also have to add the word engage, and engaged scholarship is also crucial. But for now, please join me in thanking Chris Hedges for a terrific